April 19, 1945. The ridges of Okinawa burned under a haze of cordite smoke. The coral hills, jagged and scarred by weeks of bombardment, seemed unassailable. Japanese officers had watched through their binoculars with cold confidence. To them, the American tanks below were trapped beasts, iron giants chained to the mud of the lowlands. The slopes of Shuri Castle, fortified with tunnels and pillboxes, were too steep, too treacherous, and too unforgiving for any machine of steel to conquer. The Japanese defenders waited with the patience of hunters, convinced the next American push would shatter against the hillside like waves breaking on rock. Yet, on that spring morning, something happened that defied their expectations. The ground shook not with the predictable rhythm of infantry footfalls, but with the grinding roar of tank tracks climbing where no tank should go. Sherman after Sherman clawed upward, their engines screaming like tortured beasts, treads biting into coral slopes, slick with rain and blood. They rose against the hillside like a living avalanche of steel. Japanese soldiers, hardened by years of war, stared in disbelief as the impossible unfolded before their eyes. Machine gun nests prepared to fire down into gullies found themselves staring directly into the barrels of 75mm guns forcing their way up the incline. Grenadiers froze. Officers barked orders that sounded more like prayers. The very laws of terrain, upon which the imperial defense strategy rested, were being torn apart by the grinding ascent of American armor. The battlefield itself seemed to rebel, its natural walls collapsing under the relentless momentum of iron and will. Smoke shells burst along the slopes, shrouding the tanks in a ghostly fog that drifted upward like spirits rising from the earth. Behind them, infantry advanced in disciplined waves, emboldened by the sight of armored guardians achieving the impossible. American crews inside the Shermans felt every lurch, every jolt of stone and shell beneath them. Sweat dripped down brows as steel groaned and rivets strained, but they did not falter. Radios crackled with terse commands, weaving the tanks into a coordinated surge that struck like a hammer against the heart of the Shuri line. German commanders in Europe had once mocked the Sherman as a Ronson that lit too easily. But here, on the hills of Okinawa, the Japanese faced a revelation. This so-called weak tank could move with a defiance that no doctrine had prepared them for. In the Japanese trenches, disbelief turned to horror. Their artillery, designed to rain death from above, now fired at awkward, desperate angles, struggling to depress barrels low enough to hit climbing armor. Mortars meant to pin infantry in valleys found themselves overshooting as the battlefield tilted upward. The tanks pressed higher, their silhouettes cutting through smoke and flame like phantoms. To the defenders, it seemed less like machines climbing and more like the mountains themselves had decided to move. For soldiers raised in the tradition of immovable fortresses, this was not merely a tactical shock. It was a spiritual one. The hills, once their shield, were now betraying them. Each yard gained was agony. Every few meters, a Sherman would halt under a direct hit, flames licking from hatches, and the crew scrambling out in shadows of fire. Yet more followed, climbing over the wrecks of their fallen brethren, using destroyed tanks as footholds. The Americans had brought with them more than machines. They had brought an unrelenting tide, a will to press forward no matter the cost. Observers from Japanese command posts scribbled frantic notes. Enemy tanks scaling slopes considered impassable. The words sounded more like disbelief than military reporting. To men trained to calculate every advantage of terrain, it was as though the very geometry of war had turned against them. The clash echoed like thunder across the island. Okinawa's ridges, carved by centuries of wind and rain, now groaned under the weight of mechanized war. American tank crews could see the whites of Japanese soldiers' eyes as they emerged from caves and tunnels, hurling satchel charges in desperate arcs. Some succeeded, explosions tearing apart advancing steel, but even in destruction, the climb continued. The Japanese had built their defenses with mathematical certainty, believing the Americans would be forced to bleed in the valleys. Now, with each Sherman that reached the crest, that certainty fractured. Panic rippled through ranks where discipline had been unshakable. Men who had sworn to fight to the death hesitated, confronted with a foe that seemed to rewrite the rules of combat in real time. The air was thick with contradictions, the grinding metal of tanks against coral, the cries of men drowned by the concussive blasts of artillery, and the acrid sting of burning oil carried on the wind. The climb was not just physical but symbolic, a contest of will between a nation defending its soil with ferocity and an invading force determined to pierce the last line before the Japanese homeland. The Shermans, flawed and fragile in so many other theaters, here became avatars of inevitability. Each forward lurch was more than momentum. It was destiny pushing upward, step by bloody step. When the first tanks crested the ridge and turned their guns downward into the Japanese rear positions, the defenders realized their fortress was not impenetrable. The high ground, their sanctuary, had been breached. The hills that once promised safety now trapped them in a deadly reverse slope battle, where American shells rained into bunkers not from the sea or the sky, but from the very earth rising beneath them. What had begun as disbelief became chaos. Reports filtered through tunnels, voices cracking with fear. Enemy tanks are on the heights. For the first time in years of brutal war, Japanese soldiers faced not only the enemy's firepower but also the collapse of their faith in terrain itself. The scene was apocalyptic. Flames licked upward from shattered tanks, black smoke spiraled into the sky, and the ground itself seemed to tremble as more Shermans pressed on. The sun struggled to pierce the haze, casting the battlefield in a twilight that blurred night and day. It was a vision of hell on earth, where coral turned crimson and steel roared like ancient gods awakening from slumber. This was not merely a battle. It was a revelation, a moment when the impossible became real, and the defenders of Okinawa could only watch their unshakable hills bend to the relentless will of American steel. By the spring of 1945. The world's most destructive war had reached its final crescendo. Europe trembled as the Third Reich collapsed, but in the Pacific, the fight was far from over. The island of Okinawa, only 350 miles from the Japanese home islands, had become the chosen stage for one of the bloodiest showdowns of the entire conflict. For the Americans, Okinawa was the gateway, the last stepping stone before launching an invasion of mainland Japan itself. For the Japanese, it was the sacred shield that had to be held at all costs, even if it meant annihilation. The strategic weight of the island was immense. Possessing Okinawa would give the United States an unsinkable aircraft carrier, a forward base from which bombers and naval forces could pound the Japanese homeland with impunity. The Japanese Imperial High Command understood this with brutal clarity. They transformed the island into a fortress, carving 60 miles of interconnected defenses into its hills, ridges, and caves. Unlike previous island battles, where defenders clung to beaches, the Japanese had prepared to fight in depth, luring the Americans inland into a maze of firepower. At the heart of this defense stood the Shuri Line, a network of fortifications woven into the hills themselves. Commanding this labyrinth was General Mitsuru Ushijima, a calm and disciplined officer who embodied both the pragmatism and fatalism of Japan's final defense. He and his chief of staff, General Isamu Cho, believed the hills of Okinawa would bleed the Americans white. No longer would the Japanese rely on futile banzai charges. Instead, they would grind the enemy down from impregnable positions. Every ridge, every cave, every stone wall was calculated into the defense. The geography was their greatest weapon. Tanks, the Americans' iron fist, were expected to falter against slopes too steep, too uneven, and too entrenched with hidden guns. On the American side, the campaign fell under the command of Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., a career officer with a steely resolve. Buckner understood that Okinawa would not fall in days or even weeks. It would take months of relentless pressure, supported by overwhelming firepower. The U.S. 10th Army he commanded was an unprecedented fusion of Army and Marine forces, totaling nearly 500,000 men. Their arsenal stretched from battleships offshore hurling 16-inch shells to Sherman tanks waiting for the order to roll inland. Yet Buckner's staff was grimly aware this would not be another Saipan or Iwo Jima. The terrain itself would decide the tempo. By early April, the American landing had gone smoother than anticipated. Beaches were seized with shocking ease, as if the defenders had vanished. But the apparent emptiness was an illusion. The Japanese had deliberately yielded the shoreline, conserving their strength for the hills. When the Americans advanced inland, they struck an invisible wall of resistance. Mortars, artillery, and machine guns erupted from unseen positions. Infantrymen fell in waves, pinned down by fire from caves they couldn't even spot. At every rise in the ground, the Shermans rolled forward, only to be halted by mines, anti-tank guns, and natural obstacles. American commanders had expected a brutal fight, but not this. To many officers, it seemed the Japanese had finally perfected their doctrine of defense in depth. The terrain amplified every advantage they possessed. Hills became fortresses, ravines became kill zones. Coral ridges, sharp as knives, chewed up tank treads and immobilized the machines. For infantry, it was a nightmare of close-quarters combat, where every bush concealed a sniper and every cave mouth hid a nest of death. War had slowed to a crawl, measured not in miles but in yards. At this pace, Okinawa threatened to devour men and machines alike. Yet even in this grim reality, a new chapter of the war was about to unfold. American tank commanders began to test the impossible. Where doctrine said the slopes were impassable, they experimented with raw determination and engineering grit. Shermans climbed gradients their manuals declared suicidal, aided by bulldozers, winches, and sheer stubbornness. The Japanese had dismissed the idea outright. Tanks were chained to open ground, predictable and limited. But American crews, seasoned from North Africa, Italy, and France, brought with them a philosophy of adaptation. If the enemy believed the hills were untouchable, then climbing them became a weapon in itself. For the Japanese, this was a devastating blind spot. Their strategy relied on terrain as an unyielding ally. They had designed interlocking fields of fire on the assumption that American armor would be confined to valleys. Entire firing arcs, gun pits, and ambushes were structured around that belief. But when the tanks began to rise into the hills, it broke more than lines of defense. It shattered expectations. Battles that were calculated like chess suddenly unraveled like a collapsing house of cards. The broader context made this revelation even more shocking. In 1945, Japanese forces were already stretched to their limits. Supplies were scarce, replacements were non-existent, and morale, though hardened by years of indoctrination, was brittle beneath the surface. The Americans, by contrast, had seemingly endless reserves. Every tank lost could be replaced. Every shell fired could be replenished. On Okinawa, this imbalance became stark. Japanese soldiers had hoped the island's natural fortifications would level the playing field, offsetting American industrial might with sheer terrain. When that advantage began to crumble, so too did their faith. Okinawa was not just another battlefield. It was a crucible, a glimpse into the kind of apocalyptic struggle that an invasion of mainland Japan would have demanded. Here, every tactical surprise carried strategic weight. The sight of tanks climbing hills where none should have stood was more than a battlefield oddity. It symbolized the relentless nature of the American advance and the willingness to bend or break the rules of war itself to force victory. For the men in Japanese trenches, it was a warning that even nature could not protect them. For American soldiers, it was proof that no obstacle was absolute. In this theater, in this year, on this island, the clash was not merely between armies, but between two visions of war itself. One clung to tradition, to the sacred ground, and the defensive lines carved into it. The other wielded mobility, adaptation, and unyielding pressure as weapons as powerful as any gun. The context of Okinawa framed this clash with brutal clarity. It was the old world resisting the new, the immovable object colliding with the unstoppable force, and at the heart of that collision, the tank, long dismissed as vulnerable on such terrain, emerged not as a liability, but as the spearhead of inevitability, beneath the thunder of artillery and the crackle of machine guns. The real secret of the American advance was not just steel or manpower. It was something more subtle, almost invisible, yet devastating in its effect, the hidden advantage that allowed tanks to climb hills where logic said they could not. To the Japanese defenders on Okinawa, the sight of Sherman's grinding upward looked like raw defiance of terrain. But what they could not see was the quiet orchestration behind the chaos, an orchestration born from innovation, adaptation, and the ruthless application of engineering ingenuity. The advantage began with communication. American tanks were not blind beasts lurching forward. They were part of a living network. Each Sherman carried radio sets that kept commanders in constant contact with infantry, artillery, and one another. Orders did not crawl through runners or bugles, but leapt instantly across frequencies. This meant when one tank found a gap in the hillside, the entire formation knew within seconds. When Japanese artillery locked onto a valley, American armor could redirect into ridges before the shells even landed. It was war conducted at the speed of voice, while the defenders, still reliant on couriers darting through caves, fought at the speed of footsteps. But the radios were only the beginning. American crews had spent years learning to improvise. On Okinawa, they brought with them bulldozers to carve crude ramps into coral slopes, engineers with demolition charges to blast paths where nature had closed them, and winches capable of dragging 30-ton machines upward inch by inch. Every obstacle became a challenge to be solved, not a wall to halt them. The Japanese had believed tanks were bound to valleys, but the Americans had quietly prepared to unbind them. To men watching from the Shuri line, it seemed supernatural. Yet it was nothing more than men and machines, guided by innovation, turning the impossible into routine. The hidden edge also lay in doctrine. American combined arms warfare was unlike anything the Japanese had faced. Where imperial units fought in isolated pockets, each weapon system acting with rigid independence, the Americans fused tanks, infantry, artillery, engineers, and even naval gunfire into a single organism. On Okinawa's slopes, this meant Shermans were never truly alone. Infantry swarmed alongside, rooting out hidden defenders. Artillery fired smoke to cloak the ascent. Navy destroyers offshore shifted their guns on request from tank commanders speaking through radio relays. To the Japanese, it looked as if the enemy was everywhere at once, climbing, firing, and advancing with uncanny coordination. The truth was more chilling. American doctrine had made the battlefield one continuous network, where information traveled faster than fear. Another piece of the hidden advantage was mechanical resilience. The M4 Sherman was not the most heavily armored tank of the war, nor the most powerfully armed. German Panther crews had mocked it, and Japanese anti-tank gunners knew it could burn under a well-placed hit. Yet the Sherman was forgiving in ways its enemies were not. Its engine could grind and overheat on slopes, yet keep running. Its wide tracks distributed weight better than Japanese Type 95s, giving it unexpected traction on coral and mud. And when one tank fell, another was always near to take its place. It was not indestructible, but it was dependable, a trait far deadlier on Okinawa than sheer firepower. The Japanese, by contrast, faced crippling limits. Their Type 1 Chihi and Type 97 Chiha tanks were hopelessly outdated, their armor thin, their guns weak, and their production numbers pitiful. On Okinawa, these machines were nearly absent, destroyed in earlier battles, or left behind due to fuel shortages. Instead, the Imperial Army relied almost entirely on terrain, mines, and artillery. Their doctrine assumed that armor could not penetrate the hills. When American tanks defied that assumption, the Japanese had no counter. Anti-tank guns hidden in caves fired desperately, but as Shermans climbed higher, their arcs of fire collapsed. Satchel charges and suicide attacks became the only options, a brutal testimony to a force caught without a solution. Intelligence reports later revealed just how stunned the Japanese had been. Diaries recovered from fallen officers spoke of iron beasts climbing like men and valleys betrayed by hills. In their war college doctrines, tanks were forever chained to flat ground. To see them clawing upward through coral ridges was not only shocking but also disorienting. It fractured their calculations, eroded their confidence, and left them improvising under fire. American tanks were not supposed to be there. Yet there they were, spewing fire and thunder from positions once considered inviolable. This hidden advantage extended beyond the battlefield into the realm of psychology. For American infantry slogging through mud and fire, the sight of Shermans climbing with them was a lifeline, a moving shield that seemed indomitable. Morale rose with every tank that crested a ridge, its gun barking defiance into caves that had held the line for weeks. For the Japanese, the effect was the opposite. Soldiers who had been told the hills were impregnable now saw them pierced before their eyes. What was once their sanctuary became their trap, and that psychological inversion was as lethal as any shell. American commanders understood the symbolic weight of these moments. Reports emphasized not only the tactical successes but also the demoralization inflicted on the enemy. Each hill conquered by tanks was a message. No ground, however sacred, could hold back the tide. The hidden advantage was not just technical or doctrinal. It was the ability to weaponize disbelief, to turn the enemy's assumptions into weaknesses. On Okinawa, the Japanese soldiers could not comprehend how tanks had ascended slopes designed by nature and fortified by men to be unassailable. But the truth was not magic. It was radios humming in steel hulls, engineers sweating over bulldozers, and crews refusing to yield to terrain. It was the quiet triumph of adaptation over rigidity, of innovation over tradition. And in war, those unseen advantages often mattered more than the size of a gun or the thickness of armor that eye in the eyes of the defenders. American tanks had become ghosts of iron, climbing where no machine should climb, bringing with them the crushing realization that even the earth itself could no longer protect them. Steel has its own language. And on Okinawa, that language was spoken in horsepower, armor thickness, and the cold hum of radio static. To understand why American tanks achieved what seemed impossible, one must step inside the machine itself to examine the gears, the engines, the radios, and the engineering spirit that transformed a battlefield tool into an unstoppable force. The climb up Okinawa's ridges was not magic. It was the product of design choices, manufacturing power, and technical innovations that, when combined, gave the Sherman tank an edge far beyond what its simple silhouette suggested. The heart of the M4 Sherman was its engine. Most carried the Continental R975C1 radial, a 9-cylinder, air-cooled, aircraft-derived powerhouse that generated 400 horsepower. On paper, this was not extraordinary. The German Panther boasted 700 horsepower. The Soviet T-34's diesel churned with raw torque. Yet the Sherman's engine had something its rivals often lacked: reliability. On Okinawa's coral ridges, where dust clogged filters and rain turned ground into slurry, the Sherman's radial proved stubbornly resistant to breakdown. It could run while coughing smoke, overheat without seizing, and grind against inclines with steady determination. Engineers had once worried that the Sherman's high silhouette made it vulnerable. But here, height granted leverage on the slopes, while the radial kept grinding like a heart that refused to stop beating. Beneath the hull, the tracks told their own story. The Sherman's horizontal volute spring suspension, or HVSS, distributed weight more evenly than Japanese tanks could manage. Wide tracks bit into mud and coral with surprising grip. On Okinawa, where the ridges tore lesser machines to pieces, Shermans crawled upward like insects clinging to bark. The HVSS also gave crews smoother rides, allowing gunners to aim even while moving on treacherous ground. Japanese soldiers, watching from their caves, saw tanks climbing slopes they had declared unscalable. In truth, it was not brute force but mechanical finesse, suspension, track design, and ground pressure working in harmony. And then there were the radios. The SCR 508 and SCR 528 series, standard in American armor, were not luxuries but lifelines. Operating in frequency modulation, they cut through static that crippled German and Japanese sets. With ranges of up to 15 miles, they linked tank to infantry, and tank to artillery. The Japanese, often relying on runners or primitive field telephones strung through caves, could not comprehend the coordination unfolding before them. When one Sherman clawed upward and reported a weak spot in the ridge, others knew within moments. When artillery support was needed, a commander inside steel could call it directly, adjusting fire as though the Navy's guns offshore were extensions of his own. These radios were invisible weapons, turning a collection of tanks into a hive mind of steel. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun was neither the most powerful nor the most modern by 1945. Against Panthers in Europe, it struggled. But on Okinawa, the weapon proved devastating. Japanese armor was virtually absent, leaving only fortified caves and infantry to resist. For that, the 75mm was perfect. It fired high-explosive shells with lethal efficiency, cracking open pillboxes and blasting earthworks apart. Each round carried more psychological weight than physical destruction. To the defenders, the sight of a tank not only climbing but also firing downward into their sanctuaries was crushing. For the Americans, it was proof that the Sherman's supposed weakness could become overwhelming strength in the right theater. Support vehicles amplified this technical edge. Bulldozers mounted on Sherman's carved paths where none existed. Flame tanks, fitted with M4-3 or POECWS H1-2 flamethrowers, poured rivers of fire into cave mouths, clearing the very positions meant to halt armor. Engineer vehicles laid bridges across gullies and used demolition charges to blast open blocked slopes. The Japanese had prepared to repel tanks with static defenses, but the Americans had built an army of machines designed not just to fight, but to change the battlefield itself. Terrain was not a barrier. It was a puzzle, and every piece of equipment brought a new solution. Even production numbers played their part in this technical deep dive. By 1945, over 49,000 Shermans had rolled off American assembly lines. Factories in Detroit, Chicago, and beyond could produce more tanks in a single month than Japan could in an entire year. This industrial hurricane ensured that every loss on Okinawa was quickly replaced. Where the Japanese saw a Sherman burn, another rose to take its place. It was not simply a matter of technology, but of scale. American engineering was backed by a flood of steel that made innovation not a gamble but a certainty. The Japanese, in contrast, entered Okinawa with tanks that were relics. The Type 95 Hago, barely armored and armed with a 37mm gun, was obsolete even when it was first fielded. The Type 97 Chiha, with its 57mm short-barrel gun, fared no better. Against Shermans, these machines were tin cans waiting to be crushed. Fuel shortages and logistical collapse meant even these inadequate tanks were rarely seen in battle. Instead, defenders relied on Type 147mm anti-tank guns and suicide tactics. Brave, desperate, but hopeless against steel backed by radios, engines, and production lines. Inside the Sherman, crews lived amid a symphony of mechanical sounds: the roar of the radial, the whine of gears, the crackle of the radio, and the echo of the gun breech slamming shut. Each man had his role, and each role was magnified by the technology surrounding him. The driver felt the suspension flex as coral gave way. The gunner adjusted his sight, knowing the stabilization system, crude but effective, would steady his aim. The commander scanned through the periscope, speaking into the microphone that linked him to the unseen web of war. These were not isolated men. They were nodes in a machine greater than themselves. For Japanese soldiers, staring through binoculars at tanks ascending coral walls, the technical details were unknowable. They did not see the suspension at work, or the radio chatter, or the reliability of the radial engine. What they saw was steel that refused to obey the laws of nature. To them, it was sorcery. To history, it was engineering. The hidden advantage of Okinawa was not in mystical courage or supernatural force. It was in pistons, wires, and springs, designed with enough resilience to defy terrain and doctrine alike. In the end, the climb of the Sherman was not just a feat of bravery, but of design. Every bolt, every track link, and every radio frequency played its part in turning impossible slopes into conquered ground. And in that deep, grinding ascent, the technical language of steel became the vocabulary of inevitability. The dawn of May 11th, 1945, broke over Okinawa with the rumble of artillery so vast it seemed the island itself was cracking apart. Operation Iceberg had dragged into its second month, and the American 10th Army prepared its most ferocious push yet against the Shuri line. At the center of this storm was a battlefield etched into coral and blood, the ridges of Shuri and Sugarloaf Hill. Here, tanks and men would attempt what textbooks of war declared impossible: armored assaults into vertical fortresses. It was in this crucible that the first decisive demonstration of tanks climbing Okinawa's hills unfolded. Sugarloaf Hill was a coral mound no taller than 50 feet, but its strategic weight was colossal. Rising in the center of the Japanese defensive line, it commanded fields of fire in all directions. Japanese defenders had hollowed it out with tunnels, connecting it to Horseshoe Ridge and Half Moon Hill, forming a triangle of death. The Americans would later call it one of the bloodiest pieces of ground in the Pacific. Infantry had already tried to take it, only to be shredded by interlocking fire. Now, Tank commanders proposed the unthinkable, climbing armor directly into the fight, scaling the coral slopes that even bulldozers struggled to gouge. At first light, Shermans rolled forward. The ground shook as naval guns offshore fired their opening salvos, shells screaming overhead to smash the ridgeline. Smoke billowed across the battlefield, cloaking the tanks in a shifting veil. Infantry advanced in the shadows of the armored columns, crouching low as Japanese mortars began to pound the approaches. The defenders, concealed in their tunnels, held fire until the tanks drew close, waiting to spring their ambush at point-blank range. When the Shermans reached the base of the hill, the slopes rose above them like the walls of a fortress. To infantry alone, it had been a death trap. But now, engines roared and treads bit into the coral. The climb was agony. Each tank lurched upward in bursts, their suspension straining, their hulls rocking with bone-rattling force. Japanese anti-tank gunners opened fire from concealed caves. Shells slammed into the sides of climbing armor, sending sparks flying and crews jolting against their restraints. One Sherman erupted in flames, its hatch bursting open as silhouettes of men tumbled out, rolling down the slope under machine gun fire. Yet more followed. Smoke shells hissed around them, laying down a curtain of ghostly white that clung to the hill like mist. The Shermans advanced not as isolated machines, but as a relentless wave, clawing upward inch by inch. Japanese soldiers inside Sugarloaf's tunnels could scarcely believe their eyes. Tanks were not supposed to climb. Their entire defense had been designed with the certainty that American armor would be confined to the low ground, helpless beneath the ridges. Yet here they were, steel beasts climbing into the teeth of interlocking fire. Panic rippled through the caves as grenadiers rushed to satchel charges, scrambling to throw themselves against climbing hulls. Some succeeded, detonating beneath tracks and halting tanks and fireballs. But for every Sherman that fell, another rose, pushing higher, using the wrecks of destroyed comrades as cover and footholds. By midday, Shermans had reached firing positions that no one had thought possible. Their 75 guns, designed for duels against enemy armor, now depressed downward into trench lines and pillboxes hidden on the reverse slope. High explosive shells thundered into Japanese strongholds, collapsing tunnels and filling caves with smoke and fire. Infantry surged behind them, emboldened by the impossible sight of tanks atop Sugarloaf. What had been impregnable now trembled under the weight of steel and coordination. Reports from the front carried back words that stunned headquarters. Tanks established on slopes, providing direct fire into fortifications. The Japanese counterattacked with ferocity. Waves of soldiers emerged from tunnels and suicidal charges, hurling grenades, satchel charges, and even their own bodies beneath tank treads. The battle devolved into savage chaos, where tanks fired point-blank into charging men, machine guns chattered from every angle, and flamethrowers swept across the ridgeline like rivers of fire. Shermans equipped with flamethrower attachments turned cave mouths into infernos, the screams of defenders echoing from within the earth itself. The hill became a furnace, coral walls blackened by flame and painted red by blood. Through it all, the tanks kept climbing. For every breakdown, every hit, crews improvised repairs under fire, engineers dragging spare parts up slopes where no mechanic had ever been meant to work. Radios kept the assault synchronized. Artillery adjusted by the minute, pounding unseen tunnels as called out by tank commanders who now overlooked them from positions once thought unreachable. To the Japanese, this was a nightmare made flesh. Their fortress turned against them, their sanctuary violated. What was meant to be the unbreakable spine of the Shuri line bent under the pressure of American steel. By nightfall, Sugarloaf Hill had become a charnel house. Dozens of Shermans lay destroyed, their blackened hulks smoldering against the coral slopes. Hundreds of Marines and soldiers lay scattered across the ground, testament to the cost of the ascent. Yet atop the ridge, Shermans remained. Their guns pointed downward, holding ground that had once seemed beyond reach. The Japanese counterattacked again and again in the darkness. But each assault broke against the combined wall of tanks and infantry now dug in at the crest over the following days. The battle for Sugarloaf would rage with a savagery unmatched even in the Pacific War. But its opening clash had already delivered a revelation. Tanks had climbed where no doctrine said they could. The impossible had been made real, and the Japanese defenders, once certain of their terrain advantage, now found themselves scrambling to adapt. After-action reports from surviving officers spoke of disbelief, of fire raining from heights that should have been safe, and of a line collapsing not from lack of courage but from a breach in the very laws of terrain. For the Americans, it was a grim validation. The Sherman, mocked and doubted, had proven not only its resilience but also its versatility. By climbing into Okinawa's ridges, it had turned the enemy's strongest positions into vulnerabilities. The price was high, but the psychological and strategic victory was immense. Sugarloaf Hill, once a fortress, became a grave for the defenders who believed tanks could not climb. When the smoke settled over Sugarloaf and the Shuri line continued to grind beneath the weight of American firepower, the true significance of the tank assaults revealed itself. These were not just tactical victories measured in yards of coral and bodies left on the slopes. They were blows to the very foundation of Japanese doctrine, shattering assumptions about terrain, technology, and the inevitability of defense. The strategic and psychological impact of tanks climbing Okinawa's hills was immense, echoing far beyond the ridges themselves. For the Americans, the message was clear: obstacles were illusions. Terrain that had been calculated to halt armored warfare could be conquered with persistence, ingenuity, and the combined arms doctrine that fused infantry, artillery, and armor into one seamless organism. Commanders who had feared attrition without progress now saw hope. The Sherman's ability to scale ridges transformed the geometry of the battlefield. Defenses designed to funnel attackers into kill zones collapsed as tanks appeared at angles the Japanese had not prepared to face. Suddenly, hills once thought impregnable became precarious. Reverse slopes, long a hallmark of Japanese defense, were no longer sanctuaries but death traps under the barrels of tanks firing from above. Strategically, this altered the campaign. Every fortified ridge of Okinawa, from Sugarloaf to Shuri Castle itself, had been constructed on the premise that American armor could not follow. The Japanese had concentrated their firepower on valleys, gullies, and flat approaches, expecting armor to stay chained to the lowlands. Once Shermans began cresting ridges, those carefully planned arcs of fire fractured. Entire sectors of the Shuri line were compromised, forcing Japanese commanders to divert resources, scramble for new firing positions, and expend dwindling manpower in desperate counterattacks. What had been a methodical defense turned into a reactive one, forced to answer American innovations rather than dictate the flow of battle. But it was the psychological toll that cut deepest. For the Japanese soldier, belief in the impregnability of terrain was more than military logic. It was spiritual assurance. The hills of Okinawa had been transformed into shrines of resistance, each ridge a promise that the enemy would bleed itself dry against immovable stone. When tanks clawed their way up those sacred heights, that faith shattered. Diaries recovered after the battle tell of disbelief and despair. "The enemy tanks come like gods of war," one soldier wrote. Another described watching Shermans crest a ridge, their guns turning downward, as a vision from a nightmare. The hill itself betraying us. The collapse of faith in terrain was as lethal as any shell. American infantry felt the inverse effect. For men slogging through mud, under fire from hidden caves, the sight of tanks climbing where no man believed they could go was electrifying. Morale surged as Shermans provided firepower in places once thought untouchable. Infantrymen who had cursed the coral and the slopes now marched with renewed determination, shielded and supported by the very machines that had been declared helpless. The climb of tanks became a symbol, a reminder that no barrier was beyond the reach of combined strength. At the command level, this advantage multiplied. Generals like Buckner and his staff recognized that tanks had become more than tools of destruction. They were psychological weapons. Reports emphasized not only the tactical breaches but also the enemy's visible panic. Japanese counterattacks grew increasingly desperate, relying on suicide charges, explosives strapped to bodies, and human waves hurled against steel. These tactics, once terrifying in earlier battles, now looked like acts of futility. Radios allowed American tanks to call artillery within minutes, shredding counterattacks before they could even reach the slopes. Every failed assault drained Japanese morale further, while reinforcing to Americans that adaptation had tipped the balance irreversibly. The Japanese high command could see the writing on the wall. General Ushijima and General Cho both understood that the Shuri line, despite its brilliance on paper, was collapsing under pressure it had never been designed to endure. Terrain, their greatest weapon, was no longer reliable. What remained was courage, fanaticism, and sacrifice. Yet no amount of human spirit could compensate for a strategic foundation that had been broken. The Americans had turned the hills into highways and the ridges into platforms for their advance. With every ascent, the psychological war tilted further in their favor. Even the broader war reflected this shift. News from Okinawa reached Washington and Tokyo alike. To American planners, the ability to conquer ridges with tanks reinforced the belief that even mainland Japan's mountainous terrain could be breached with sufficient coordination. For Japanese leaders, the reports deepened dread. If Okinawa's coral hills could not halt American armor, how could Honshu's mountains be expected to? The notion of the homeland as an unassailable fortress began to crumble. Among the soldiers themselves, the impact was visceral. Japanese troops who had sworn to fight to the death now fought under the shadow of inevitability. Courage turned to desperation, and desperation to panic. For Americans, each ridge conquered by tanks became a step closer to home, a promise that their suffering was not endless. The tank was no longer just a machine of steel. It was a beacon of progress, a rolling proof that the war, however brutal, was moving toward its end. The strategic advantage also lay in momentum. War is as much about perception as it is about numbers. By proving that tanks could climb where none believed they could, the Americans seized initiative not just tactically, but psychologically. Every battle thereafter was fought under a new assumption. Nothing was truly safe. The Japanese could not retreat to terrain and expect sanctuary. They could not rely on coral ridges or hilltop caves as eternal bastions. Every stronghold was now vulnerable, and that vulnerability sapped the will to resist as surely as casualties that on Okinawa. The clash of steel and stone became more than a military contest. It was a revelation, a rewriting of the battlefield's rules. The Japanese defenders saw their faith in terrain betrayed, their confidence shaken, and their courage strained to the breaking point. The Americans, meanwhile, found strength in the impossible, turning tanks into avatars of inevitability. The hills that had once promised to halt the invaders instead carried them forward. In the end, the strategic and psychological impact of tanks climbing Okinawa's ridges was not measured solely in maps gained or defenses broken. It was measured in the collapse of certainty, the erosion of faith, and the dawning realization that no matter how fierce the defense, the tide of steel would not be stopped. When the guns finally fell silent on Okinawa in June 1945, the island lay in ruins, a landscape of shattered ridges, burned villages, and seas of mud where once coral had gleamed white beneath the sun. More than 200,000 souls had been consumed by the battle, soldiers and civilians alike. Yet within that devastation lay lessons that stretched far beyond the Pacific. Among them was a revelation etched into every hill that Sherman had climbed. The future of war would belong not to static fortresses or natural terrain, but to mobility, adaptability, and the ability to connect men and machines into one living organism. For the Japanese, the shock endured long after the last shot. Survivors of the Imperial Army carried home memories of tanks that had risen against nature itself, defying everything their doctrines had promised. In their war colleges, generals had preached the sanctity of terrain and the impregnability of fortified heights. On Okinawa, they had watched those truths collapse beneath climbing steel. The realization gnawed at them. If hills and coral ridges could not hold, then nothing could. This despair fed into the broader collapse of Japan's strategic confidence, deepening the conviction that the homeland itself might not withstand the onslaught that loomed across the sea. For the Americans, Okinawa became both a warning and a validation. The warning was clear. Even victory came at a staggering price. The battle claimed over 12,000 American lives and wounded tens of thousands more. Tank crews, though victorious, had seen comrades burned alive in their machines, their Shermans turned into coffins of steel on slopes that demanded everything. Yet the validation was undeniable. The doctrine of combined arms, The integration of radios, engineers, artillery, and armor had transformed impossible terrain into conquered ground. It was proof that ingenuity could overcome any natural barrier. And in that proof lay the seeds of modern warfare, the legacy of Okinawa, stretched forward into the Cold War. American strategists, studying the battle, saw the future not in the thickness of armor or the size of guns, but in the network that connected them. Radios, once a hidden advantage, became the foundation of network-centric warfare. Tanks were no longer isolated weapons, but nodes in a vast web of communication, capable of calling fire, coordinating movement, and adapting in real time. The idea that victory depended on connection rather than sheer firepower would echo in Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf War, where American armor once again moved faster, struck harder, and adapted more quickly than any foe expected. Even technology itself bore the imprint of Okinawa's lessons. Engineers took note of the Sherman's resilience and its ability to climb against doctrine and pushed future designs toward greater mobility. Suspension systems grew more advanced, engines more powerful, and radios more integrated. By the time M1 Abrams tanks rolled into battle decades later, their digital fire control systems and satellite links carried within them the same principle that had driven Shermans up coral ridges: the belief that no terrain, no assumption, could remain inviolate if innovation pressed against it. For veterans who returned home, the memory of Okinawa was bittersweet. They remembered the grinding climbs, the smell of burning oil, and the cries of men trapped in steel coffins. They remembered hills that seemed to devour life itself. Yet they also remembered the pride of seeing impossible barriers fall, of watching tanks crest ridges where no one believed they could. For them, those moments symbolized not just survival but triumph, the proof that even in the darkest struggle, human ingenuity could carve a path forward. The Japanese, too, carried their lessons into the post-war era. As their nation rebuilt, military thinkers studied the American way of war with a mixture of awe and dread. They acknowledged what their soldiers had whispered in terror, that the Americans had made the battlefield into a network, while Japan had fought as isolated fragments. The lesson was harsh, but it shaped a new era. In time, Japan would become one of the world's leaders in technology, embracing the very principles of connectivity and adaptability that had once broken their defenses. The legacy of Okinawa was not confined to history books. In every modern military exercise, in every armored column linked by satellite, and in every doctrine that prizes speed, flexibility, and connection over static defense, the echoes of those climbing Shermans can be heard. The hills of Okinawa taught the world that war is not won by holding ground, but by mastering the ability to move, to adapt, and to break through barriers thought eternal. Yet the greatest legacy was human. The battle revealed the courage of men on both sides. Japanese soldiers who fought with fanatical determination even as their faith in terrain collapsed, and American tank crews who drove forward into near-certain death to prove that no hill was unconquerable. Their struggle remains carved into the coral ridges of Okinawa, a reminder of war's brutality and of its revelations that in the end, the lesson was stark and eternal. Fortresses can fall. Terrain can betray. Even the earth itself cannot guarantee safety. What endures is the will to adapt, the ability to connect, and the relentless drive to move forward. One American commander reflected after the war, standing over the ruins of Shiri Castle. "We fought the ground itself, and we won." The tanks that climbed Okinawa's hills carried more than men and steel. They carried the future, and in their grinding ascent, they proved a truth that still resonates in every battlefield of the modern age. In war, it is not the strongest armor that prevails, nor the highest wall that endures, but the force that learns, adapts, and climbs beyond what others believe impossible.